In the remote hills of Illyria, where the Balkan mountains meet the Adriatic winds, a child was born around the year 482 who would one day rule the greatest empire on earth. The village of Tauresium lay forgotten among the rugged peaks, a place where shepherds watched their flocks and farmers scratched out meager livings from rocky soil. Here, in this humble settlement that barely appeared on imperial maps, Petrus Sabatius entered the world, the future Emperor Justinian I. The boy who would reshape the Roman Empire came from peasant stock, his family among the countless rural folk who formed the backbone of the late Roman world. His father, a simple farmer whose name has been lost to history, worked land that had been tilled by generations before him. The family spoke Latin mixed with local Illyrian dialects, their lives governed by the rhythm of seasons and the ancient customs of mountain people. Young Petrus grew up among stone houses with thatched roofs, breathing the crisp mountain air and learning the hard lessons of survival that would serve him well in the cutthroat world of imperial politics. But destiny had already begun to weave its threads around this unremarkable village. Petrus had an uncle, a man named Justin who had left Tauresium decades earlier with nothing but ambition and a strong sword arm. Justin had joined the imperial army, that great machine that still defended what remained of Roman civilization. Through courage, cunning, and the kind of brutal competence that the empire desperately needed, Justin had risen through the ranks. While his nephew played in the dusty streets of their mountain village, Justin was fighting barbarians along the Danube frontier, learning the arts of war and leadership that would eventually carry him to the very throne of the Caesars. The transformation of their family's fortunes began when word reached Tauresium that Uncle Justin had achieved something extraordinary. He had not merely survived the chaos of the late 5th century, he had thrived in it. Reports filtered back to the village that Justin commanded elite troops, that he had distinguished himself in battle, that he had caught the attention of the imperial court itself. For the simple farming family of Petrus, this news must have seemed like tales from another world. The Roman Empire, with its great capital of Constantinople, its vast bureaucracy, and its ancient traditions, was as distant from their daily lives as the stars themselves. Yet Justin had not forgotten his humble origins or the nephew he had left behind in the mountains. As his own prospects brightened, he began to think of the boy's future. The empire needed capable men, and family loyalty ran deep in Illyrian culture. When Petrus reached adolescence, perhaps around the age of 15, a messenger arrived in Tauresium with an invitation that would change everything. Uncle Justin, now a powerful figure in the imperial guard, summoned his nephew to Constantinople. The young man would leave behind the only world he had ever known to seek his fortune in the greatest city on earth. The journey from Tauresium to Constantinople was more than a physical passage. It was a leap across centuries of social development. The boy who had herded goats in Illyrian hills would soon walk the marble corridors of the great palace, where the ghost of Caesar Augustus still seemed to linger in the purple-draped halls. The road east wound through ancient cities and provinces that had been Roman for centuries, each mile bringing young Petrus closer to the beating heart of an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. Constantinople itself must have overwhelmed the young provincial. The city that Constantine had built on the bones of ancient Byzantium was a marvel of late Roman engineering and artistry. Its massive walls, rising from the waters of the Golden Horn, protected nearly 500,000 souls within their embrace. The great dome of the original Hagia Sophia dominated the skyline, while the Hippodrome could hold 100,000 spectators for the chariot races that consumed the city's passion. Streets paved with marble led past forums decorated with statues looted from across the Mediterranean world. The imperial palace complex was a city within a city, its gardens and pavilions housing the elaborate court that governed from Britain to Mesopotamia. For a young man from the mountains, the sensory overload must have been extraordinary. The smells of spices from India and silk from China mingled with the salt air from the Bosphorus. Merchants from every corner of the known world hawked their wares in a dozen languages. The sound of church bells competed with the roar of crowds in the Hippodrome and the constant bustle of the empire's greatest port. This was the new Rome, the Christian capital that had inherited the glory of the ancient world while adapting to the spiritual needs of a transformed age. Uncle Justin had prepared a place for his nephew in this bewildering metropolis. The young man would not merely survive in Constantinople. He would be educated there, trained in the arts of governance and law that would prepare him for great responsibilities. Justin had recognized something in the boy that others might have missed: a sharp intelligence, an ability to absorb and synthesize complex information, and the kind of driving ambition that could carry a man from shepherd's hut to emperor's throne. The education that young Petrus received in Constantinople was unlike anything available in the provinces. The capital still maintained schools where the traditions of classical learning survived alongside the new Christian scholarship. He studied Latin and Greek, not merely as spoken languages but as the vehicles of literature, law, and philosophy. The works of Cicero and Virgil, of Plato and Aristotle, opened before him like doors to hidden chambers of human wisdom. He learned rhetoric, that most Roman of arts, which would serve him well in the Senate and the law courts. Mathematics and geometry, essential for anyone who hoped to understand military engineering or architectural projects, became second nature to him. But perhaps most importantly, the future emperor studied law. The Roman legal system, developed over centuries of practical experience, represented one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements. Young Petrus learned to navigate the complex relationships between statute and precedent, between imperial decree and local custom. He absorbed the principles of justice that had evolved from the 12 tables of the early republic to the sophisticated jurisprudence of the Christian Empire. This legal education would prove crucial when he later undertook his greatest civilian achievement, the codification of Roman law that would influence European legal systems for more than a millennium. Alongside his formal education, Petrus received a more practical schooling in the workings of imperial administration. Uncle Justin, now a powerful figure in the palace guard, introduced his nephew to the complex world of court politics. The young man learned to read the subtle signals of imperial favor and disfavor, to understand the intricate relationships between civil and military officials, and to navigate the dangerous waters of religious controversy that could make or break careers in the Christian Empire. The transformation of the mountain boy into a sophisticated courtier was gradual but profound. He learned to wear the silk robes of the imperial bureaucracy with the same ease that he had once worn rough peasant clothing. His manners became refined, his speech polished, his understanding of ceremony and protocol complete. Yet beneath this civilized exterior, something of the hard mountain character remained, a toughness and determination that would serve him well in the brutal world of 6th century politics. As Petrus matured into young manhood, those around him began to recognize his exceptional abilities. His intelligence was sharp and practical, capable of grasping complex problems quickly and formulating effective solutions. His memory was phenomenal, allowing him to recall vast amounts of legal precedent and administrative detail. Most importantly, he possessed the kind of focused ambition that could sustain him through the long years of preparation that would be necessary before he could hope to achieve real power. The young man also displayed an early fascination with the grandeur of the Roman past. He studied the histories of the great emperors, learning from their successes and failures. The conquests of Trajan, the administrative reforms of Diocletian, the legal innovations of Constantine, all became part of his mental arsenal. He began to dream of an empire restored to its former greatness, of Roman legions once again marching into Africa and Italy, of the Mediterranean becoming a Roman lake as it had been in the days of Augustus. Uncle Justin, watching his nephew's development with satisfaction, began to include him in more sensitive discussions about imperial policy. The older man had risen far in the imperial hierarchy, and his opinions carried weight in the councils of power. Through these conversations, young Petrus gained insights into the challenges facing the empire, the barbarian kingdoms that had seized Roman territory in the west, the Persian threat in the east, the religious controversies that divided Christian communities, and the economic pressures that strained the imperial treasury. The relationship between uncle and nephew deepened beyond mere family loyalty into something approaching genuine partnership. Justin valued the younger man's education and analytical abilities, while Petrus respected his uncle's practical experience and political acumen. Together, they began to plan for a future that might see their family rise to the very pinnacle of imperial power. The peasant boy from Taurigium had become a force to be reckoned with in the most sophisticated political environment on earth. The wheel of fortune that had carried a simple Illyrian soldier to the heights of imperial power was about to complete another revolution. In the year 518, Emperor Anastasius died without leaving a clear heir, plunging the empire into one of those succession crises that had plagued Rome for centuries. The palace guards, the Senate, and the people of Constantinople all had their favorites, but none commanded universal support. In such moments of uncertainty, the empire often turned to its most reliable institution, the army. Uncle Justin, now Count of the Excubitors and commander of the Imperial Guard, found himself at the center of this political maelstrom. The palace guards whom he commanded were the ultimate arbiters of imperial succession, their loyalty more decisive than any legal precedent or popular acclaim. At nearly 70 years of age, Justin was respected by his soldiers, trusted by the church hierarchy, and acceptable to the Senate. Most importantly, he had avoided the factional disputes that had destroyed other candidates. When the crucial moment arrived, his men proclaimed him Emperor Justin I, and the great city accepted their choice. The coronation of his uncle transformed the life of the young man still known as Petrus Sabatius. Overnight, the nephew of the emperor became one of the most powerful figures in the empire. He was granted the honorary title of count and given extensive estates that provided both wealth and political influence. But more significantly, he was brought into the inner circle of imperial decision-making, where his education and analytical abilities quickly made him indispensable to his aging uncle. Justin, for all his military competence and political acumen, had received little formal education. He could barely read and write, skills that were essential for governing an empire that ran on written law and bureaucratic procedure. His nephew, with his thorough grounding in Roman law and administrative practice, became his most trusted advisor and, increasingly, the real power behind the throne. The young man who had once herded goats in Illyrian mountains now helped govern an empire that stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates. It was during these early years of his uncle's reign that Petrus Sabatius began to be known by the name that would echo through history, Justinian. The transformation from his original name was more than ceremonial. It represented his complete adoption of Roman identity and imperial ambition. He was no longer the provincial nephew seeking advancement, but a prince of the blood with his own vision for the empire's future. The partnership between uncle and nephew worked remarkably well. Justin provided the military credibility and personal relationships that legitimized their rule, while Justinian supplied the intellectual framework and administrative expertise that made their government effective. Together, they began to address the challenges that had accumulated during the previous reign: religious divisions, military weaknesses, and the gradual erosion of Roman authority in the western provinces. But even as Justinian consolidated his political position, he was about to encounter the person who would fundamentally alter both his personal life and his imperial destiny. In the taverns and theaters of Constantinople, a young woman named Theodora was making her own remarkable journey from the depths of society toward the heights of power. Her path to the throne would be far more unconventional than his own, crossing boundaries of class and respectability that few in the ancient world had ever dared to traverse. Theodora's origins were as humble as Justinian's own. But while his family had been respectable peasants, hers dwelt in the shadows of urban poverty. Her father, Acacius, had been a bearkeeper at the Hippodrome, one of the thousands of minor functionaries who made possible the great spectacles that entertained the masses. When he died while Theodora was still a child, her mother was left to raise 3 daughters in desperate circumstances. The family's survival depended on finding new employment in the only world they knew: the gritty underside of public entertainment. The young Theodora first appeared in the Hippodrome as a child performer, part of the elaborate theatrical presentations that preceded the main chariot races. But as she matured, her striking beauty and quick intelligence drew her toward a different kind of performance. She became an actress, a profession that in the 6th century occupied an ambiguous position between art and prostitution. The theater world of Constantinople was a realm of moral complexity, where talent and beauty could provide both opportunity and exploitation. The historical sources paint contrasting pictures of Theodora's early career. Some, particularly The Secret History of Procopius, describe her in terms of scandalous detail that may reflect more about the author's prejudices than about historical reality. Others suggest that she was a skilled performer who used her theatrical talents to rise above her circumstances. What seems certain is that she possessed exceptional intelligence, remarkable beauty, and the kind of determined ambition that could carry someone from the theater district to the imperial palace. Theodora's life took a crucial turn when she left Constantinople as the mistress of a provincial governor bound for North Africa. This journey exposed her to a different world beyond the capital's theater district. She experienced the broader empire, saw how Roman authority functioned in the provinces, and perhaps most importantly, encountered the religious and philosophical currents that were reshaping the Christian world. When the relationship ended and she found herself stranded in Alexandria, she underwent what appears to have been a genuine spiritual transformation. The woman who eventually returned to Constantinople was changed in fundamental ways. She had abandoned her theatrical career and embraced a more ascetic lifestyle influenced by the monastic traditions she had encountered in Egypt. Her intelligence, always sharp, had been refined by broader experience and deeper reflection. She had learned to navigate different social worlds and to understand the religious controversies that divided Christian communities. Most crucially, she had developed a sense of purpose that transcended mere personal advancement. It was this transformed Theodora who came to the attention of Justinian sometime in the early 520s. The exact circumstances of their first meeting have been lost to history, but the attraction between them was both immediate and profound. Here was a woman who could match his own intelligence and ambition, who understood the complexities of imperial politics, and who shared his vision of what the empire might become. For Theodora, the rising prince represented not just personal salvation but the chance to influence the course of history itself. The relationship between Justinian and Theodora scandalized Constantinople society. A future emperor consorting with an actress violated every convention of imperial dignity and social propriety. The senatorial aristocracy, already suspicious of the upstart Illyrian dynasty, saw this liaison as confirmation of their worst fears about the new ruling family. Church leaders, despite their general support for Justin's regime, worried about the moral implications of such a prominent relationship. But Justinian was not merely infatuated with a beautiful woman. He had found in Theodora a true partner whose capabilities complemented his own. Where he could be indecisive, she showed unwavering determination. Where he might rely too heavily on advisors, she trusted her own judgment. Where he sometimes lost himself in theoretical considerations, she remained focused on practical results. Their relationship represented a genuine meeting of minds as much as a romantic attachment. The couple's desire to marry faced seemingly insurmountable legal obstacles. Roman law, dating back centuries, explicitly forbade marriages between senators and actresses. The legislation reflected deep-seated prejudices about the moral character of performers, but it also served to maintain the rigid social hierarchies that conservative aristocrats considered essential to imperial stability. For Justinian to marry Theodora, the law itself would have to be changed. The process of legalizing their union revealed both the power that Justinian had already accumulated and the resistance that their relationship generated. Working through his uncle, he managed to secure the passage of new legislation that allowed actresses who had abandoned their profession to marry into the highest ranks of society. The law was carefully crafted to appear general in nature, but everyone understood that it was designed to permit one specific marriage. The resistance to this legal change was intense but ultimately futile. Some senators openly opposed the legislation, arguing that it violated traditional Roman values and threatened the social order. Certain court officials whispered that the empire was being degraded by barbarian influences. Even some church leaders expressed private concerns about the propriety of the marriage. But Justinian had the support of his uncle, the loyalty of the army, and the grudging acquiescence of those who recognized that opposing the imperial family was a dangerous game. The wedding of Justinian and Theodora, celebrated sometime around 525, was a carefully orchestrated display of imperial grandeur designed to overwhelm any lingering doubts about the bride's suitability. The ceremony took place in the Great Palace, with all the elaborate ritual that surrounded imperial occasions. Theodora, clothed in silk and jewels, carried herself with the dignity of one born to power. The transformation was complete. The actress had become an empress. The marriage proved to be one of the most successful partnerships in the history of the Roman Empire. Theodora brought to their union not just beauty and intelligence, but a practical understanding of human nature that complemented Justinian's more theoretical approach to governance. She understood the common people in ways that he, despite his humble origins, had forgotten during his years of education and court life. She could read the mood of the capital streets and anticipate the reactions of different social groups to imperial policies. More importantly, Theodora possessed the kind of decisive courage that would prove crucial in moments of crisis. Where Justinian might hesitate and consider multiple options, she could cut through uncertainty and choose a course of action. Her influence on him was profound and generally positive, pushing him toward bolder decisions and more consistent policies. The man who had been shaped by years of careful calculation found in his wife a partner who could provide the emotional strength that his intellectual gifts sometimes lacked. As Justin aged and his health began to decline, the question of succession became increasingly urgent. The emperor had no children of his own, and everyone understood that power would pass to his nephew. The process began gradually, with Justinian assuming more and more responsibility for daily governance, while his uncle retained the ceremonial aspects of imperial authority. By 527, this informal arrangement was formalized when Justin proclaimed Justinian his co-emperor, ensuring a smooth transition of power. The joint rule of uncle and nephew lasted only a few months. Justin's death in August 527 left Justinian as sole emperor, with Theodora as his empress. The transformation was complete. The peasant boy from Taurigium and the actress from the Hippodrome now ruled the Roman Empire. Their coronation ceremony, held in the magnificent Church of Holy Wisdom, was attended by representatives from across the known world. The couple who had overcome every obstacle of birth and prejudice now faced the ultimate test, governing an empire that faced challenges on every frontier and divisions within every province. The early months of Justinian's reign revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of his partnership with Theodora. She proved to be a formidable political operator, building networks of support among court officials, church leaders, and influential citizens. Her intelligence network, developed during her years in Constantinople's underworld, provided the imperial couple with information that the formal bureaucracy often missed. She understood the importance of public opinion in ways that traditional emperors had often ignored. But their partnership also generated continuing controversy. Conservative senators never fully accepted Theodora's elevation, seeing in her presence a symbol of the empire's moral decline. Some church leaders remained uncomfortable with her past, despite her obvious piety and generous support for religious institutions. The couple's childlessness became a subject of court gossip and political speculation, with various factions hoping to influence the eventual succession. Despite these challenges, Justinian and Theodora approached their imperial responsibilities with remarkable energy and ambition. They understood that they had been given an extraordinary opportunity to shape the course of history, and they were determined to make the most of it. The empire they inherited was beset by problems. Barbarian kingdoms controlled most of the western provinces. The Persian Empire threatened the eastern frontier, religious controversies divided Christian communities, and economic pressures strained the imperial treasury. But rather than being discouraged by these challenges, the imperial couple saw them as opportunities to restore the empire to its former greatness. They began to develop ambitious plans for military reconquest, legal codification, architectural projects, and religious reconciliation. The scope of their vision was breathtaking, nothing less than the restoration of Roman authority throughout the Mediterranean world and the creation of a truly Christian empire that would serve as a model for all humanity. The partnership between Justinian and Theodora represented more than a successful marriage. It embodied a new model of imperial governance that recognized the importance of both intellectual analysis and practical wisdom, of both careful planning and decisive action. Together, they were about to embark on one of the most ambitious reigns in the history of the Roman Empire, a reign that would see both spectacular successes and devastating setbacks, but that would ultimately transform the ancient world in ways that neither could have imagined when they first met in the taverns of Constantinople. The early years of Justinian's sole rule seemed to promise a golden age for the Roman Empire. The young emperor, brilliant and energetic, threw himself into the work of governance with an intensity that amazed even his closest advisors. Theodora, now fully established as empress, proved to be an invaluable partner in navigating the complex politics of the imperial court. Together, they began implementing ambitious reforms designed to strengthen the empire's finances, codify its laws, and restore its military might. But beneath the surface of this apparent success, dangerous tensions were building that would soon explode into the most serious crisis of Justinian's reign. The root of the coming disaster lay in the unique political culture of Constantinople, where the ancient Roman tradition of public spectacle had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous. The Hippodrome, that vast arena where 250,000 spectators could gather to watch chariot races, had become much more than a venue for entertainment. It was the one place where the people of the capital could gather in large numbers, where they could express their opinions about imperial policy, and where the emperor himself was expected to appear regularly before his subjects. The chariot races that dominated the Hippodrome were organized around 4 racing teams, each identified by a color: the blues, greens, reds, and whites. Over the centuries, these racing factions had gradually evolved into something resembling political parties, with the blues and greens emerging as the dominant forces. Each faction had its own organization, its own financial resources, and its own network of supporters that extended far beyond the racing enthusiasts. They maintained their own militia units, controlled various neighborhoods of the city, and even had their own theological preferences in the religious controversies that divided the Christian world. The Blue faction traditionally drew its support from the upper classes, government officials, and Orthodox Christians who supported the imperial church hierarchy. They were generally conservative in their political outlook and supportive of imperial authority. The Greens, by contrast, attracted merchants, artisans, and members of the lower classes, along with those who favored various forms of religious dissent. The competition between these factions was intense and often violent, turning the Hippodrome into a powder keg that could explode at any moment. Justinian's relationship with the circus factions was complicated by his own background and political needs. As a relative newcomer to the imperial throne, he needed the support of the established political forces in the capital. Initially, he had cultivated good relationships with both major factions, but gradually he began to favor the Blues, perhaps because of their orthodox religious stance and their support for imperial authority. This preference was subtle but noticeable, and it began to generate resentment among the Greens and their supporters. The emperor's legal reforms, though well-intentioned, inadvertently added to the growing tensions. His efforts to eliminate corruption in the imperial bureaucracy and to impose more efficient tax collection methods created anxiety among various groups who had profited from the old system. Merchants worried about stricter enforcement of commercial regulations. Provincial governors feared closer supervision of their activities. Even some church officials were concerned about proposed changes in ecclesiastical administration. The immediate trigger for the crisis came from an unexpected source: the emperor's judicial policies. In January 532, following a particularly violent clash between Blues and Greens that had left several people dead, Justinian ordered the arrest and trial of the ringleaders from both factions. 7 men were condemned to death, but when the executions were carried out, the scaffolding collapsed and 2 of the condemned men survived. Taking this as a sign of divine intervention, the Orthodox Patriarch intervened to secure sanctuary for the survivors in a nearby church. The emperor's response to this situation would prove to be a crucial miscalculation. Rather than taking the opportunity to show mercy and thereby defuse tensions, Justinian insisted that the law must take its course. He ordered his officials to remove the men from sanctuary and complete their executions. This decision outraged both factions, who saw it as a violation of church sanctuary and an example of the emperor's inflexibility. For the first time in memory, Blues and Greens found themselves united in opposition to imperial policy. The crisis escalated rapidly when Justinian appeared in the Hippodrome for the races on January 13, 532. Instead of the usual factional cheering, he was greeted by a unified chant of Nika, meaning victory or conquer, from both Blues and Greens. The crowd was demanding that he dismiss 2 of his most unpopular officials: John the Cappadocian, his efficient but ruthless finance minister, and Tribonian, his legal advisor who was overseeing the controversial law reforms. When Justinian refused to respond to their demands, the crowd's mood turned ugly. The emperor's attempt to continue with the races as if nothing had happened only inflamed the situation further. The unified chanting grew louder and more threatening. Missiles began to be thrown at the imperial box. Finally, recognizing that the situation was beyond control, Justinian left the hippodrome abruptly, but his departure was interpreted as a sign of weakness that emboldened the rioters. What followed was a week of unprecedented violence and destruction that brought the empire to the brink of collapse. The rioters, now numbering in the tens of thousands, poured out of the hippodrome and into the streets of Constantinople. They began by attacking government buildings, setting fire to the offices of the prefect and destroying records of taxes and legal proceedings. The violence quickly spread as various groups with grievances against the imperial government joined the uprising. The rioters' fury was directed particularly at symbols of imperial authority and recent reforms. They attacked the homes of unpopular officials, destroyed tax records, and freed prisoners from the city's jails. The great Church of Holy Wisdom, the original Hagia Sophia, was set ablaze and completely destroyed. The Senate House, where Justinian had implemented many of his legal reforms, was burned to the ground. Even the imperial palace itself came under attack, with mobs pressing against its gates and demanding the emperor's abdication. The scale of the destruction was staggering. Entire districts of the city were consumed by flames as the rioters moved from building to building, destroying everything associated with the imperial government. The magnificent baths of Zizippus, with their priceless collection of ancient statues, were reduced to rubble. The Basilica of the Holy Apostles suffered severe damage. Streets that had been paved with marble were torn up and the stones used as weapons. The careful work of centuries of urban development was being undone in a matter of days. Perhaps most alarmingly for Justinian, the rioters began to develop political objectives that went beyond mere protest. They started calling for the emperor's abdication and the elevation of a new ruler who would be more responsive to their demands. Various members of the senatorial aristocracy, some of whom had never fully accepted the legitimacy of the Illyrian dynasty, began to see the riots as an opportunity to regain power. The name of Hypatius, a nephew of the former emperor Anastasius, began to circulate as a potential replacement for Justinian. The emperor's initial response to the crisis was hesitant and ineffective. He tried to appease the rioters by dismissing John the Cappadocian and Tribonian, the two officials whose unpopularity had helped trigger the uprising. But these concessions, rather than calming the situation, were interpreted as signs of weakness that only encouraged further demands. The mob grew bolder and the political opposition more organized. By the fifth day of the riots, it was clear that half measures would not be sufficient to restore order. The crisis reached its climax when Hypatius was proclaimed emperor by the rioters in the hippodrome. This was no longer a spontaneous uprising but a coordinated attempt to overthrow the government. The rebels controlled most of the city, the imperial palace was under siege, and even some of the emperor's own guards were beginning to waver in their loyalty. For the first time since ascending the throne, Justinian faced the real possibility of defeat and deposition. It was at this moment of supreme crisis that the character of both Justinian and Theodora was truly revealed. The emperor, faced with the apparent collapse of his authority, began to consider the possibility of flight. His advisors were divided, some counseled resistance to the end, others suggested strategic retreat that might allow him to return with military reinforcements from the provinces. A ship was prepared in the palace harbor, and arrangements were made for the imperial couple to escape to safety. The meeting in the palace where the emperor's fate was decided has become one of the most famous scenes in Byzantine history. As Justinian wavered between fight and flight, Theodora rose to deliver the speech that would define not only her own legacy but the entire future of the Roman Empire. Her words, preserved by the historian Procopius, ring across the centuries with their defiant courage and unwavering determination. "My lords," she began, addressing the assembled courtiers and military commanders, "the present time, above all others, is inopportune for flight, even though it brings safety. For while it is impossible for a man who has seen the light not to die, for one who has reigned it is unendurable to be a fugitive. May I never be separated from this purple, and may I not live that day on which those who encounter me shall not address me as mistress." The empress continued with words that would echo through history. "If now it is your wish to save yourself, O emperor, there is no difficulty. For we have much money, and there is the sea, here the boats. However, consider whether it will not come about after you have been saved that you would gladly exchange that safety for death. As for myself, I approve a certain ancient saying that royalty is a good burial shroud." Theodora's speech had an electric effect on the assembled council. Her courage shamed those who had counseled flight and inspired those who favored resistance. The empress had reminded them all that some things were worth dying for, that the purple of imperial authority was not merely a garment but a sacred trust that could not be abandoned in the face of mob violence. Her words crystallized the resolve of the imperial party and provided the moral foundation for the desperate measures that would follow. The military solution to the crisis was implemented with ruthless efficiency. Justinian's most trusted generals, Belisarius and Mundus, were given clear instructions to restore order by any means necessary. The plan they devised was simple but devastating. While the rioters were celebrating the proclamation of Hypatius in the Hippodrome, imperial troops would seal the exits and massacre everyone inside. It was a strategy that would solve the immediate crisis but at a cost that would haunt the empire for generations. The execution of this plan required perfect timing and absolute determination. Belisarius, with his veteran soldiers loyal to the emperor, positioned his forces at the main entrances to the Hippodrome. Mundus, commanding troops from the imperial guard, took control of the secondary exits. The rioters, focused on their celebration and believing they had already won, were completely unprepared for what was about to happen. The massacre that followed was systematic and complete. As the trapped crowds realized what was happening, panic spread through the vast arena. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The professional soldiers cut down everyone they could reach: men, women, and children who had been caught up in the excitement of the moment. The sand of the arena, which had so often been stained with the blood of gladiators and wild animals, now absorbed the blood of Constantinople's citizens. The death toll was staggering. Contemporary sources speak of 30,000 dead, though the exact number will never be known. What is certain is that the Hippodrome became a charnel house, filled with the bodies of those who had dared to challenge imperial authority. The political opposition that had seemed so formidable just hours before was literally destroyed in a single afternoon of violence. The immediate aftermath of the massacre was a silence that settled over Constantinople like a shroud. The city that had been in revolt for a week was now terrorized into submission. The rioters who had survived the Hippodrome fled to their homes and barricaded themselves inside. The political opposition that had encouraged the uprising melted away, with many prominent figures fleeing the city or seeking sanctuary in churches. The rebellion that had threatened to topple the government was over. Justinian's response to his victory was both magnanimous and calculated. He pardoned most of the surviving rioters, recognizing that they had been caught up in events beyond their control. He restored John the Cappadocian and Tribonian to their positions, demonstrating that he would not be intimidated by mob pressure. But he also began a massive program of reconstruction that would transform Constantinople into a more magnificent city than ever before. The lessons of the Nika riots were burned into Justinian's consciousness and would influence every aspect of his future reign. He had learned that imperial authority, no matter how legitimate, was always fragile and could be challenged by determined opposition. He had discovered that in moments of crisis, decisive action was more important than careful deliberation. Most importantly, he had seen that his partnership with Theodora was not just personally satisfying but politically essential. The empress's role in the crisis had been crucial. Her courage had prevented a shameful flight that would have destroyed their dynasty forever. Her understanding of the political dynamics of the capital had helped them navigate the crisis more effectively than the emperor's more theoretical approach might have allowed. The riots had proven that Theodora was not just a beautiful woman who had captivated the emperor, but a true partner in the exercise of imperial power. The reconstruction of Constantinople that followed the riots was more than just a restoration of damaged buildings. It was a statement of imperial determination and a demonstration of the resources that the government could deploy when necessary. The new buildings were grander than their predecessors, the the streets wider and more impressive. The city that emerged from the ashes of the riots was a worthy capital for an empire that aspired to greatness. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Nika riots was the psychological transformation they produced in Justinian himself. The emperor, who had come to power with high ideals and ambitious plans, had been forced to confront the brutal realities of political survival. He had learned that good intentions were not enough, that effective governance sometimes required harsh measures, and that the price of failure was not just personal disappointment but the collapse of civilization itself. The week of violence had also demonstrated the importance of military loyalty and professional competence. Belisarius and Mundus had proven their worth not just as battlefield commanders but as instruments of imperial will. Their effectiveness in suppressing the riots would lead to their selection for even greater responsibilities in the years to come. The empire that emerged from the crisis was stronger and more unified, but it was also more ruthless and more willing to use force to achieve its objectives. As Constantinople slowly returned to normal life, the imperial couple began planning the ambitious projects that would define the rest of their reign. The destruction of the original Hagia Sophia had cleared the way for an even more magnificent church that would serve as the crown jewel of Christian architecture. The legal reforms that had been interrupted by the riots would be resumed and expanded into a comprehensive codification of Roman law. Most ambitiously, plans were being developed for military campaigns that would restore Roman authority in the lost provinces of the West. The Nika riots had been the great test of Justinian's reign, and he had passed it through a combination of his wife's courage, his general's competence, and his own willingness to do whatever was necessary to preserve imperial authority. The emperor, who had once been a peasant boy from Illyria, had proven that he possessed the hard qualities necessary for survival in the brutal world of 6th century politics. The partnership with Theodora had been forged in the fires of crisis and had emerged stronger than ever. The stage was now set for the great enterprises that would make Justinian's reign legendary. The riots had cleared away the political opposition that might have hindered his ambitious plans. The reconstruction of Constantinople had demonstrated the resources at his disposal. The loyalty of his generals had been proven beyond doubt. Most importantly, the emperor himself had been transformed from an idealistic reformer into a hardened survivor who understood that great achievements required great sacrifices. The Nika riots would be remembered as the moment when Justinian truly became emperor, when the theoretical authority of his position was transformed into the practical power necessary to reshape the world. The peasant boy and the actress had survived their greatest test and were now ready to attempt the restoration of the Roman Empire to its former glory. The destruction and reconstruction that followed the Nika riots had demonstrated both the fragility and the resilience of imperial power. As Constantinople rose from its ashes more magnificent than before, Justinian's thoughts turned increasingly toward the broader vision that had sustained him through the darkest moments of the crisis. The riots had been a painful but necessary lesson in the realities of political survival, but they had also cleared the way for far grander enterprises. The emperor, who had proven his ability to govern the capital, was now ready to attempt something that no ruler had dared for over a century: the restoration of Roman authority throughout the Mediterranean world. The dream of reconquest was not merely a product of Justinian's personal ambition, though his ego certainly played a role. It was rooted in a profound understanding of what the Roman Empire had once been and what it might become again. For nearly a century, the western provinces had been ruled by barbarian kingdoms that had carved up the corpse of the Western Roman Empire. The Vandals controlled North Africa from their capital at Carthage, the Ostrogoths governed Italy from Ravenna, and the Visigoths held sway in Spain. These kingdoms had preserved some elements of Roman law and administration, but they were ruled by Arian Christians who were viewed as heretics by the Orthodox population they governed. The strategic situation that confronted Justinian in the 530s was both challenging and promising. The barbarian kingdoms, despite their military origins, had grown soft during generations of settled rule. Their armies, once composed of fierce warrior bands, now included increasing numbers of Roman provincials who had little enthusiasm for fighting against the imperial forces. More importantly, the religious divisions between Arian rulers and Orthodox subjects created opportunities for imperial intervention that a skilled diplomat could exploit. The emperor's analysis of the military situation was characteristically thorough. The imperial army, reformed and professionalized during the early years of his reign, was arguably the finest military force in the Mediterranean world. Its core consisted of professional soldiers who were well-trained, well-equipped, and loyal to the imperial government. The officer corps had been purged of incompetence and potential traitors, leaving a command structure that combined tactical expertise with unwavering loyalty to the emperor. Most importantly, Justinian possessed in Belisarius a military commander whose abilities bordered on genius. The general who had so ruthlessly suppressed the Nika riots was a master of both conventional warfare and innovative tactics. His campaigns against the Persians on the eastern frontier had demonstrated his ability to win victories even when outnumbered and outmaneuvered. His troops trusted him completely, and his strategic vision complemented the emperor's own ambitious plans perfectly. The first target of the reconquest was carefully chosen. The Vandal kingdom in North Africa was the weakest of the barbarian states, plagued by succession disputes and internal rebellions. The death of King Hilderic in 533 had brought to power Gelimer, a usurper whose legitimacy was questionable even among his own people. The Orthodox population of North Africa had been persecuted by their Arian rulers for decades and could be expected to welcome imperial liberation. Most importantly, the Vandal navy, once the terror of the Mediterranean, had declined to the point where it posed no serious threat to an imperial invasion force. The preparation for the African campaign revealed the sophisticated logistical capabilities that the imperial government had developed during its administrative reforms. The invasion force assembled at Constantinople was a marvel of organization and equipment. 15,000 infantry and cavalry, selected from the best units in the imperial army, were supported by a fleet of 500 ships crewed by 30,000 sailors. The vessels carried not only weapons and armor but also the siege engines, medical supplies, and provisions necessary for an extended campaign in hostile territory. The expedition that sailed from Constantinople in June 533 represented more than a military campaign. It was a statement of imperial intent that reverberated throughout the Mediterranean world. The purple banners of the imperial fleet, flying from ships that had not been seen in Western waters for generations, announced that Rome was returning to claim its inheritance. The psychological impact of this demonstration was as important as its military significance, inspiring hope among the Orthodox populations of the occupied territories while spreading fear among their barbarian rulers. The voyage to Africa proceeded with remarkable smoothness, a testament to the careful planning that had preceded the expedition. The fleet stopped at Sicily, where the imperial forces were welcomed by the local population and were able to gather intelligence about conditions in the Vandal kingdom. The information they received was encouraging. Gelimer's forces were scattered throughout the kingdom. His navy was unprepared for serious resistance, and significant portions of the population were ready to support the imperial cause. The landing at Caput Veda, some 150 miles south of Carthage, was accomplished without opposition. Belisarius had chosen his landing site carefully, selecting a location that would allow his forces to advance on the Vandal capital while avoiding the main enemy concentrations. The imperial army that marched inland was disciplined and confident, its morale boosted by the enthusiastic reception they received from the local population. The first major engagement of the campaign, the Battle of Ad Decimum, fought just 10 miles from Carthage, demonstrated the tactical superiority of the imperial forces. Gelimer's army, hastily assembled and poorly coordinated, was decisively defeated by Belisarius's veterans. The Vandal king's brother was killed in the fighting, and the barbarian forces scattered in confusion. The road to Carthage lay open, and the imperial army advanced triumphantly toward the ancient city that had once been Rome's greatest rival. The capture of Carthage on September 15, 533, was accomplished with startling ease. The city's population, weary of Vandal rule and eager for the restoration of Roman authority, opened their gates to the imperial forces. Belisarius, displaying the diplomatic skills that complemented his military abilities, immediately proclaimed the restoration of Roman law and Orthodox Christianity. The Vandal nobility who had remained in the city were treated with clemency, while the Orthodox clergy emerged from hiding to celebrate the end of Arian persecution. The wealth that fell into imperial hands with the capture of Carthage was staggering. The Vandal royal treasury, accumulated over a century of piracy and taxation, contained vast quantities of gold and silver. The art treasures that had been looted from throughout the Mediterranean world during the Vandal conquests were recovered and prepared for shipment back to Constantinople. Most symbolically important were the vessels from the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, which had been carried from Rome to Carthage during the Vandal sack of 455 and were now restored to Christian hands. But the campaign was far from over. Gelimer had escaped from the battlefield at Ad Decimum and was attempting to rally support for continued resistance. The Vandal garrisons in other cities remained loyal to their king, and the Berber tribes of the interior were uncertain about their allegiance to the new Roman administration. Belisarius understood that military conquest had to be followed by political consolidation if the reconquest was to be permanent. The pursuit of Gelimer into the interior of Africa tested the endurance and adaptability of the imperial forces. The terrain was harsh and unfamiliar, the climate challenging, and the local tribes potentially hostile. But Belisarius's troops, hardened by years of frontier warfare, adapted quickly to the new conditions. Their disciplined advance forced Gelimer to retreat ever deeper into the mountains, where his ability to coordinate resistance was severely limited. The final defeat of the Vandal kingdom came at the Battle of Tricamerum in December 533. Gelimer's last army, composed of desperate Vandal warriors and uncertain Berber allies, was surrounded and annihilated by the imperial forces. The Vandal king himself escaped from the battlefield but was reduced to wandering in the mountains as a fugitive. His eventual surrender in March 534 marked the end of the Vandal kingdom and the complete restoration of Roman authority in North Africa. The triumph that celebrated the African victory was one of the most spectacular ceremonies in the history of Constantinople. Belisarius, loaded with honors and treasure, rode through the streets of the capital while crowds cheered the restoration of Roman glory. The captive Vandal nobles, including Gelimer himself, were paraded before the people as visible proof of imperial victory. The treasures of Carthage, including the temple vessels, were displayed in a procession that reminded spectators of the great triumphs of ancient Rome. But even as Constantinople celebrated, Justinian was already planning the next phase of his reconquest. The success in Africa had demonstrated the feasibility of his grand strategy while providing the resources necessary for even more ambitious campaigns. The wealth of Carthage would help finance the liberation of Italy, while the demonstrated effectiveness of the imperial army would encourage potential allies throughout the former Western Empire. The Italian campaign, launched in 535, presented far greater challenges than the African expedition. The Ostrogothic kingdom was larger, more populous, and better organized than the Vandal state. Its king, Theodahad, was weak and unpopular, but the Gothic nobility possessed a strong military tradition and controlled formidable fortifications throughout the peninsula. The Orthodox population of Italy was indeed eager for liberation from Arian rule, but the country's geography favored defenders who could retreat to mountain strongholds and force the invaders into costly siege warfare. The initial phase of the Italian campaign proceeded with encouraging success. Belisarius landed in Sicily and quickly overran the island, encountering only token resistance from the Gothic garrisons. The Sicilian population welcomed the imperial forces as liberators, and the island's resources provided an excellent base for operations against the Italian mainland. The psychological impact of the Sicilian conquest was significant, demonstrating that the imperial forces could project power throughout the Mediterranean and encouraging potential allies on the Italian peninsula. The crossing to Italy and the capture of Naples revealed both the strengths and limitations of the imperial strategy. The city's formidable fortifications required a lengthy siege that tested the patience and resources of the imperial forces. When the city finally fell, the imperial troops, frustrated by the prolonged resistance, engaged in extensive looting that alienated portions of the Italian population. Belisarius's efforts to maintain discipline and protect civilians were only partially successful, and the incident demonstrated the difficulties of conducting a war of liberation in populated areas. The advance on Rome, the eternal city that had once ruled the Mediterranean world, was fraught with symbolic significance. The Gothic garrison abandoned the city without a fight, perhaps recognizing that they could not defend such an extensive perimeter with the limited forces at their disposal. Belisarius's entry into Rome in December 536 was a moment of profound historical significance. For the first time in 60 years, the ancient capital was under Roman control again. The restoration of Roman authority in the Eternal City was celebrated throughout the empire as proof that Justinian's vision of reconquest was not merely a dream but an achievable reality. The emperor himself, though he remained in Constantinople, was acclaimed as the new Augustus, the ruler who had restored the empire to its former greatness. The psychological impact of the Roman conquest extended far beyond the military sphere, inspiring loyalty among imperial subjects and fear among the empire's enemies. But the Gothic response to the loss of Rome demonstrated the resilience of barbarian resistance. The new Gothic king, Witiges, was a more formidable opponent than his predecessor. He organized a comprehensive strategy for recovering the lost territories, mobilizing the full resources of the Gothic kingdom for a campaign that would test the imperial forces to their limits. The siege of Rome that began in 537 would prove to be one of the most dramatic military encounters of the entire reconquest. The year-long siege of Rome tested every aspect of imperial military capability. The Gothic forces, numbering perhaps 100,000 warriors, completely surrounded the city and attempted to starve the defenders into submission. Belisarius, with only 5,000 troops, had to defend a perimeter of nearly 20 miles against overwhelming odds. The siege became a contest of endurance and ingenuity, with both sides developing new tactical innovations to gain advantage over their enemies. The defense of Rome showcased Belisarius's tactical genius and the discipline of his troops. The imperial forces, though vastly outnumbered, maintained their cohesion and fighting effectiveness throughout the siege. They conducted sorties against the Gothic siege works, defended the city's walls against repeated assaults, and maintained supply lines that kept the population fed despite the blockade. The general's ability to coordinate the defense while maintaining morale among both soldiers and civilians was a masterpiece of military leadership. The Gothic siege was ultimately broken by the arrival of imperial reinforcements and the exhaustion of the besieging forces. Witiges, recognizing that his strategy had failed, withdrew his army to Ravenna, the Gothic capital. The relief of Rome was celebrated throughout the empire as a victory comparable to the great triumphs of ancient history. Belisarius had proven that Roman military virtues could overcome even the most desperate odds. The capture of Ravenna in 540 seemed to complete the reconquest of Italy. Witiges surrendered to Belisarius, and the Gothic nobility acknowledged imperial authority. The treasures of the Gothic kingdom, accumulated over generations of rule, were prepared for shipment to Constantinople. The reunification of the Mediterranean world under Roman rule appeared to be within reach. But the initial success of the Italian campaign proved to be deceptive. The Gothic people, despite the surrender of their leadership, were not reconciled to imperial rule. The heavy taxation required to finance the reconquest generated resentment among the Italian population. The imperial garrison forces, spread thin across the peninsula, were vulnerable to guerrilla attacks and local uprisings. Most crucially, the emergence of Totila as a new Gothic leader provided a focus for continued resistance. Totila's rebellion, which began in 541, demonstrated the limitations of the imperial reconquest strategy. The new Gothic king was a charismatic leader who understood that he could not defeat the imperial forces in conventional warfare, but could wear them down through persistent guerrilla campaigns. His forces, consisting of Gothic warriors supplemented by disaffected Italians, proved remarkably effective at disrupting imperial administration and isolating the garrison forces. The recapture of Rome by Totila in 546 was a devastating blow to imperial prestige. The city that had been liberated with such fanfare was once again under barbarian control, and the Gothic forces had demonstrated their ability to reverse the apparently decisive victories of the previous decade. The reconquest that had seemed so successful was revealed to be incomplete and perhaps unsustainable. The imperial response to Totila's resurgence required a fundamental reassessment of strategy and resources. Belisarius was recalled from the east, where he had been conducting operations against the Persians, and given responsibility for restoring imperial authority in Italy. But the general found himself facing a very different situation than the one he had encountered during his earlier campaigns. The Italian population, exhausted by years of warfare and taxation, was no longer enthusiastic about imperial liberation. The Gothic forces, strengthened by success and popular support, were more formidable than ever. The final phase of the Italian campaign fell to Narses, the imperial chamberlain who had been appointed to replace Belisarius. Narses brought with him a larger army and more extensive resources than had been available to his predecessor. His victory over Totila at the Battle of Tigini in 552 finally ended effective Gothic resistance and secured Roman control over the Italian peninsula. The death of Totila in the battle removed the last charismatic leader who might have united barbarian opposition to imperial rule. The reconquest of Italy was completed with the capture of the last Gothic strongholds in 553. The surviving Gothic nobility either submitted to imperial authority or fled to other barbarian kingdoms. The peninsula was reorganized as an imperial province, with Roman law and administration restored throughout the territory. The dream of reuniting the Mediterranean world under Roman rule had been achieved, at least temporarily. But the cost of the reconquest wars was staggering. The imperial treasury, despite the wealth captured from the Vandals and Goths, was severely strained by the expense of maintaining large armies in distant provinces. The demographic losses from decades of warfare had reduced the population of the reconquered territories significantly. The administrative challenges of governing provinces that had been independent for generations proved far more complex than the military challenges of conquest. The eastern provinces, stripped of troops and resources to support the western campaigns, faced increasing pressure from Persian attacks and barbarian raids. The delicate balance that had maintained peace on the empire's primary frontiers was disrupted by the concentration of resources on the reconquest. The vision of restored Roman unity had been achieved, but at the cost of weakening the empire's traditional defensive capabilities. The Persian Wars that continued throughout the period of Western reconquest demonstrated the limitations of imperial resources and the dangers of strategic overstretch. The conflict with the Sassanid Empire, Rome's traditional rival, required constant vigilance and substantial military forces. The emperor's attempt to simultaneously reconquer the West and defend the East placed unprecedented strains on imperial capabilities. The peace treaty with Persia, finally negotiated in 562, provided the empire with breathing space but required substantial tribute payments that further strained the imperial treasury. The agreement secured the eastern frontier but at the cost of acknowledging Persian equality and accepting limitations on Roman expansion in that direction. The empire that had reconquered the Mediterranean had been forced to accept strategic constraints that would limit its future options. The final assessment of the Reconquest Wars reveals both the achievements and limitations of Justinian's grand strategy. The military successes were undeniable. Roman authority had been restored throughout the Mediterranean. The barbarian kingdoms had been destroyed, and the empire had been reunited under a single ruler. The psychological impact of these victories was enormous, demonstrating that the Roman Empire retained the capacity for greatness and inspiring loyalty among its subjects. But the reconquest had also revealed the empire's structural weaknesses and resource limitations. The campaigns had required enormous expenditures that strained the imperial economy. The administrative challenges of governing the reconquered territories proved more complex than anticipated. The demographic losses from warfare had weakened the empire's long-term capabilities. Most importantly, the concentration of resources on Western reconquest had left the empire vulnerable to threats from other directions. The legacy of the Reconquest Wars would influence imperial policy for generations. The restored territories would be lost again within decades, but the memory of the achievement would inspire future emperors to attempt similar campaigns. The military innovations developed during the campaigns would influence imperial tactics for centuries. The administrative lessons learned from governing diverse populations would shape imperial policy throughout the remaining history of the Byzantine Empire. The emperor who had dreamed of restoring Roman unity had achieved his goal, but at costs that would ultimately prove unsustainable. The Reconquest Wars represented both the pinnacle of imperial ambition and the beginning of imperial decline. The Rome that Justinian had reunited was magnificent but fragile, glorious but temporary, a final flowering of ancient greatness before the long twilight of the medieval world. The flames that had consumed the original Church of Holy Wisdom during the Nika riots had destroyed more than just a building. They had obliterated one of the most sacred spaces in the Christian world. The loss of the ancient basilica, where emperors had been crowned and where the Orthodox Patriarch had conducted the most solemn ceremonies of the faith, was a wound that cut deep into the spiritual heart of the empire. But from this destruction would emerge an opportunity that would define not only Justinian's reign but the entire future of Christian architecture. Even before the ashes of the riots had cooled, the emperor's mind was already turning toward the reconstruction of what had been lost. This was not merely a matter of replacing a damaged building. It was an opportunity to create something unprecedented, an architectural statement that would proclaim the glory of God and the majesty of the empire to all who beheld it. The church that would rise from the ruins would be more than a place of worship. It would be a symbol of imperial triumph over chaos, of Christian faith over heresy, and of Roman civilization over barbarian darkness. The vision that took shape in Justinian's mind was breathtaking in its ambition. The new Hagia Sophia would not simply restore what had been lost. It would surpass every architectural achievement of the ancient world. The emperor who had reunited the Mediterranean under Roman rule would crown his military achievements with a building that would serve as the spiritual center of the Christian empire for all time. This structure would demonstrate that the age of Justinian represented not decline from ancient greatness but the creation of something entirely new and magnificent. The selection of architects for this unprecedented project revealed the emperor's understanding that conventional approaches would not suffice for such an ambitious undertaking. Rather than relying on traditional builders who worked within established architectural traditions, Justinian chose two men whose backgrounds combined practical engineering knowledge with theoretical mathematical understanding. Anthemius of Tralles was a mathematician and engineer who had written treatises on mechanical devices and geometric principles. Isidore of Miletus was an expert in physics and mathematics who had edited the works of ancient geometers and understood the structural principles that governed large-scale construction. The partnership between these two remarkable men would produce architectural innovations that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in the 6th century. Their design for the new Hagia Sophia combined Roman engineering techniques with mathematical principles that had never before been applied to religious architecture. The result would be a building that seemed to defy the laws of physics, creating interior spaces that appeared to float in air while supporting enormous loads with unprecedented efficiency. The central challenge that Anthemius and Isidore faced was the emperor's demand for a church that would surpass every previous architectural achievement. This meant creating interior spaces larger than any previously constructed, supporting these spaces with innovative structural systems, and crowning the entire composition with a dome that would appear to touch the heavens themselves. The technical difficulties involved in such a project were staggering, requiring engineering solutions that had never been attempted in the ancient world. The foundation work for the new church began in February 532, just weeks after the riots had ended. The site, cleared of debris from the destroyed basilica, was prepared with the same meticulous care that would characterize every aspect of the construction. The foundations were laid deeper than any previous building in Constantinople, extending down to bedrock to ensure that the unprecedented loads of the proposed structure would be safely supported. The foundation walls, built of massive stone blocks bonded with specially formulated mortar, created a platform capable of supporting the architectural marvel that would rise above. The construction of Hagia Sophia required the mobilization of resources on a scale that had rarely been seen in the ancient world. The imperial treasury, enriched by the wealth captured during the Reconquest Wars, provided unlimited funding for the project. 10,000 skilled craftsmen were assembled from across the empire, representing every specialty needed for the construction. Marble cutters from the Greek islands, metalworkers from Syria, painters from Italy, and countless other artisans converged on Constantinople to participate in the creation of this architectural wonder. The materials assembled for the construction represented the wealth of the entire Mediterranean world. Marble was quarried from the finest sources across the empire: green marble from Thessaly, red marble from Egypt, white marble from the Greek islands, and purple marble from Asia Minor. Columns were taken from ancient temples throughout the empire, including 8 porphyry columns from the Temple of the Sun in Rome and other precious elements from sites across the Mediterranean. The bronze used in the construction was of the highest quality, while the gold and silver decorations represented the accumulated wealth of generations. The revolutionary structural system that Anthemius and Isidore developed for Hagia Sophia solved problems that had challenged architects for centuries. The central feature of their design was an enormous dome, 102 feet in diameter, that would appear to float above the main worship space without visible means of support. This dome was supported not by traditional walls but by a series of half-domes and arches that distributed its weight in ways that had never been attempted before. The mathematical precision required to calculate these load paths and design the supporting structures represented a breakthrough in architectural engineering. The construction of the dome itself required innovations in both materials and techniques. Rather than using the solid stone construction that had characterized previous domes, the architects employed a system of lightweight bricks arranged in sophisticated patterns that provided maximum strength with minimum weight. The mortar used to bond these bricks was specially formulated to achieve exceptional strength while remaining workable during the construction process. The entire dome was built using a complex system of temporary supports that held the structure in place until the mortar had cured and the dome became self-supporting. The interior decoration of Hagia Sophia represented the pinnacle of 6th century artistic achievement. The walls were covered with marble panels arranged in intricate patterns that created visual effects of extraordinary beauty. The marble was selected not only for its color and quality, but for the natural patterns in the stone that could be matched and arranged to create symmetrical designs. The skilled craftsmen who cut and installed these panels possessed techniques that had been developed over centuries of Roman architectural practice. The mosaics that decorated the upper portions of the church were created by artists who represented the finest traditions of Byzantine art. Gold leaf was applied to countless thousands of small glass cubes called tesserae, which were then arranged to create images of extraordinary brilliance and beauty. The gold backgrounds of these mosaics created an effect of heavenly radiance that seemed to transform the entire interior into a vision of paradise. The technical skill required to create mosaics of this quality on such a vast scale represented generations of accumulated expertise. The liturgical furnishings of Hagia Sophia were crafted with the same attention to detail and quality that characterized every aspect of the construction. The altar was constructed from precious materials and decorated with gold and silver ornaments of extraordinary beauty. The pulpit from which the gospel was read was carved from marble and decorated with intricate patterns that demonstrated the highest levels of craftsmanship. The throne from which the emperor participated in religious ceremonies was designed to reflect both his temporal authority and his role as God's representative on earth. The acoustic properties of Hagia Sophia were carefully considered during the design process. The dome and supporting structures were shaped to create acoustic effects that would enhance the liturgical ceremonies conducted within the space. The singing of the choir was amplified and refined by the building's geometry, creating an otherworldly sonic environment that added to the spiritual impact of the worship experience. The mathematical principles that governed these acoustic effects were as sophisticated as those used in the structural engineering. The construction of Hagia Sophia required 5 years of intensive labor, with work proceeding simultaneously on multiple aspects of the project. The coordination required to manage such a complex construction effort demonstrated the sophisticated administrative capabilities that the imperial government had developed. Supplies had to be delivered from across the empire, craftsmen had to be housed and fed, and the various construction trades had to be coordinated to ensure that each phase of the work proceeded smoothly. The dedication of Hagia Sophia on December 27, 537, was one of the most magnificent ceremonies in the history of the Byzantine Empire. The emperor, accompanied by the patriarch and the entire court, entered the completed church for the first time. The effect of the interior, with its soaring dome and glittering mosaics, was so overwhelming that Justinian is reported to have exclaimed, "Solomon, I have outdone thee." The comparison to the legendary Temple of Solomon was not mere hyperbole. The new church represented an architectural achievement that surpassed anything in the ancient world. The impact of Hagia Sophia on those who first experienced it was profound and lasting. The dome appeared to float in space, supported by nothing visible to the observer below. The play of light on the marble surfaces and gold mosaics created constantly changing patterns of extraordinary beauty. The vast interior space, unobstructed by columns or other supports, could accommodate thousands of worshippers while maintaining perfect sight lines to the altar. The building seemed to embody the transcendent nature of divine presence in ways that no previous architecture had achieved. The architectural innovations pioneered in Hagia Sophia influenced church design throughout the Byzantine Empire and beyond. The principles of dome construction developed by Anthemius and Isidore were applied to countless other buildings, creating a distinctive Byzantine architectural style that would persist for centuries. The mathematical principles underlying the structural systems were studied and refined by later architects, leading to further innovations in large-scale construction. The decorative techniques developed for the church influenced artistic traditions throughout the Christian world. But Hagia Sophia was only the most magnificent example of a building program that transformed the entire empire. Justinian's architectural projects extended from Britain to Mesopotamia, creating a network of churches, fortifications, and public buildings that demonstrated imperial power and promoted imperial ideals. The resources devoted to these projects were enormous, representing perhaps the largest construction program in the history of the ancient world. The fortification program that accompanied the church building was equally impressive in its scope and ambition. The empire's borders were secured by a comprehensive system of walls, towers, and fortified cities that represented the most advanced military engineering of the age. The long walls that protected the approaches to Constantinople were rebuilt and extended, creating defensive systems that would protect the capital for centuries. Similar fortifications were constructed throughout the empire, from the Danube frontier to the borders of Persia. The urban planning projects undertaken during Justinian's reign transformed cities throughout the empire. Streets were widened and paved, water supply systems were improved, and new public buildings were constructed to serve the needs of growing populations. The attention to infrastructure demonstrated the emperor's understanding that architectural grandeur had to be supported by practical improvements in urban life. The cities that emerged from these projects were more beautiful, more functional, and more conducive to the cultural and economic life of the empire. The monastery and church construction program extended imperial influence into the spiritual life of the empire's subjects. Hundreds of new religious buildings were constructed, providing centers for worship, education, and social services throughout the imperial territories. These buildings served not only religious functions but also political ones, demonstrating imperial commitment to Orthodox Christianity and providing rallying points for imperial loyalty. The decorative programs that adorned these buildings created a visual language that reinforced imperial ideology throughout the empire. Mosaics, frescoes, and sculptural programs depicted imperial victories, religious themes, and imperial portraits that reminded viewers of the connection between earthly and heavenly authority. The artistic traditions developed during this period influenced religious art throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The economic impact of Justinian's building program was enormous. The construction projects provided employment for thousands of skilled craftsmen while creating markets for materials and supplies from across the empire. The wealth that flowed through these projects stimulated economic growth in countless communities while demonstrating the empire's prosperity and power. The completed buildings served as permanent advertisements for imperial achievement and capability. The maintenance and staffing of these buildings required the creation of new administrative systems that would persist long after Justinian's death. The complex hierarchies of priests, caretakers, and officials needed to operate these institutions became permanent features of imperial administration. The educational institutions associated with many of these buildings helped preserve and transmit the cultural heritage of the empire. The legacy of Justinian's building program extended far beyond the 6th century. The architectural innovations pioneered during his reign influenced building techniques throughout the medieval period and beyond. The artistic traditions developed for these projects shaped religious and secular art for centuries. The urban planning principles applied to imperial cities influenced city development throughout the Mediterranean world. The symbolic power of these buildings, particularly Hagia Sophia, continued to inspire and influence political and religious leaders long after the empire that created them had vanished. The Dome of Hagia Sophia became a model for Islamic architecture when the Ottomans conquered Constantinople, while the building's influence on Renaissance architects helped shape the development of European architecture. The vision of imperial grandeur expressed in these buildings continued to inspire rulers and artists throughout the medieval and modern periods. The building program that began with the reconstruction of Hagia Sophia represented more than architectural achievement. It embodied a vision of imperial greatness that transformed the physical environment of the empire while expressing the spiritual and political ideals of the age. The emperor who had reunited the Mediterranean under Roman rule had created a built environment worthy of his achievements, leaving behind monuments that would inspire awe and admiration for more than a millennium. The peasant boy from Illyria had become a builder whose works would outlast the empire itself, creating a legacy in stone and marble that proclaimed the glory of the age of Justinian to all subsequent generations. While the Great Dome of Hagia Sophia rose triumphantly above Constantinople and imperial armies restored Roman authority across the Mediterranean, another revolution was taking place in the quiet chambers of the imperial palace. This transformation would prove no less significant than the military conquests or architectural marvels that captured the attention of contemporaries. In the archives and libraries where scholars labored over ancient texts, Justinian was orchestrating a legal revolution that would reshape the foundations of civilization itself. The emperor's passion for legal reform was rooted in his earliest education in Constantinople. His thorough grounding in Roman law had revealed to him both the magnificent achievements of centuries of jurisprudence and the chaotic confusion that had accumulated over generations of legal development. The Roman legal system, which had evolved organically over nearly 1,000 years, contained layer upon layer of sometimes contradictory legislation, judicial decisions, and scholarly commentary. What had once been a coherent system of justice had become a labyrinth that even expert lawyers found difficult to navigate. The practical problems created by this legal chaos were enormous. Judges in different parts of the empire might reach contradictory decisions on identical cases, depending on which authorities they chose to follow. Lawyers spent years mastering the intricacies of legal precedent, yet still found themselves uncertain about the correct interpretation of fundamental principles. Citizens seeking justice discovered that their rights depended not on clear legal principles, but on their attorney's ability to navigate the maze of conflicting authorities. The very foundations of Roman civilization, the rule of law itself, were being undermined by the system's complexity. The emperor's vision for legal reform was characteristically ambitious. He proposed nothing less than the complete systematization of Roman law, creating a unified legal code that would eliminate contradictions, clarify fundamental principles, and provide clear guidance for judges and lawyers throughout the empire. This would not merely be a compilation of existing laws, but a comprehensive reformation that would preserve the best of Roman legal tradition while adapting it to the needs of a Christian empire. The man chosen to lead this unprecedented undertaking was Tribonian, a brilliant legal scholar whose expertise in Roman jurisprudence was matched by his understanding of the emperor's vision. Tribonian had survived the political upheavals of the Nika riots, where his unpopularity had nearly cost him his position, and had emerged as one of Justinian's most trusted advisors. His appointment as head of the legal commission represented the emperor's determination to place this crucial project in the hands of someone who shared his commitment to comprehensive reform. The commission that Tribonian assembled represented the finest legal minds of the empire. 10 of the most distinguished lawyers and judges were selected to work alongside him, bringing together expertise in every area of Roman law. These men possessed not only theoretical knowledge but practical experience in the courts, understanding how legal principles actually functioned in the daily administration of justice. Their combined expertise would be essential for creating a legal system that was both intellectually coherent and practically workable. The first task undertaken by the commission was the compilation of the Codex Justinianus, a systematic collection of imperial constitutions dating back to the reign of Hadrian. This work, completed in 529, represented the first comprehensive organization of imperial legislation in Roman history. The commissioners reviewed thousands of imperial decrees, eliminating those that were obsolete, resolving contradictions between different enactments, and organizing the surviving material according to logical principles. The result was a coherent body of statutory law that provided clear guidance on the emperor's legislative intentions. But the Codex was only the beginning of the commission's work. The more challenging task was the compilation of the Digest, a systematic collection of jurisprudential opinions that would preserve the wisdom of centuries of Roman legal scholarship. This project required the commissioners to review over 3 million lines of legal commentary written by the great jurists of the past, selecting the most valuable passages and organizing them into a coherent system. The work was monumental in scope, requiring not only legal expertise but editorial skills of the highest order. The Digest, completed in 533, represented perhaps the greatest achievement of legal scholarship in human history. The commissioners had distilled the essence of Roman jurisprudence into 50 books that covered every aspect of legal practice. Private law, public law, criminal law, and administrative law were all systematically organized according to logical principles. The work preserved the opinions of the greatest legal minds of the past while eliminating the contradictions and inconsistencies that had plagued the system for centuries. The principles that guided the compilation of the digest reflected both Roman legal tradition and Christian moral philosophy. The commissioners emphasized the importance of equity and justice, ensuring that the law would serve not merely the interests of the powerful but the cause of justice for all citizens. The influence of Christian thought was evident in the emphasis on human dignity and the protection of the weak, while the Roman tradition of legal rationality ensured that the system remained intellectually coherent. The third component of the legal reform was the Institutes, a textbook designed to introduce students to the principles of Roman law. This work, also completed in 533, was intended to replace the chaotic collection of materials that had previously been used in legal education. The Institutes presented the fundamental principles of Roman law in a logical sequence, providing students with a clear understanding of how the system worked as a whole. The work was written in clear, accessible language that made complex legal principles understandable to beginning students. The educational impact of the Institutes was profound and lasting. Law schools throughout the empire adopted the work as their standard text, creating a generation of lawyers who shared a common understanding of legal principles. The systematic approach to legal education that the Institutes embodied would influence legal training for centuries, establishing patterns of legal thought that would persist long after the empire itself had vanished. The fourth component of Justinian's legal reform was the Novelli, a collection of new laws enacted after the completion of the earlier works. These laws addressed contemporary problems and reflected the emperor's ongoing commitment to legal development. The Novelli covered a wide range of topics, from administrative reforms to religious legislation, demonstrating the emperor's understanding that law must evolve to meet changing circumstances. The compilation of the Novelli revealed the practical challenges of maintaining a coherent legal system in a complex empire. New problems required new solutions, but these solutions had to be consistent with the principles established in the earlier works. The commissioners developed procedures for ensuring that new legislation would conform to the systematic principles of the reformed legal code, creating mechanisms for legal development that would preserve the coherence of the system. The impact of Justinian's legal reforms extended far beyond the boundaries of the Byzantine Empire. The systematic approach to law that the Commission had developed provided a model for legal development that would influence legal systems throughout Europe. The principles of Roman law preserved in the Justinian Code would become the foundation for the legal systems of most European nations, creating a common legal heritage that would persist for centuries. The reception of Roman law in medieval Europe was facilitated by the clarity and systematic organization of Justinian's legal works. Scholars in Italy, France, and Germany found in the Justinian Code a comprehensive legal system that was far superior to the fragmented local laws that had developed during the early medieval period. The rediscovery of Roman law in the 11th and 12th centuries provided European civilization with the legal tools needed for economic development and political organization. The influence of Justinian's legal reforms on canon law was equally significant. The systematic approach to legal compilation that had been developed for civil law was adapted for ecclesiastical use, creating comprehensive collections of church law that would govern Christian communities for centuries. The principles of legal reasoning that had been refined in the compilation of the digest influenced the development of theological thought and ecclesiastical administration. The commercial law provisions of the Justinian Code were particularly important for the development of European commerce. The systematic treatment of contracts, property rights, and commercial transactions provided merchants with clear legal frameworks that facilitated long-distance trade. The principles of commercial law preserved in the Code would influence the development of commercial practices throughout the medieval period and beyond. The family law provisions of the Justinian Code reflected both Roman legal tradition and Christian moral teachings. The systematic treatment of marriage, divorce, and inheritance provided clear guidance on fundamental social relationships while protecting the interests of women and children. The influence of Christian thought was evident in the emphasis on the permanence of marriage and the protection of family stability. The criminal law provisions of the Code, represented a synthesis of Roman legal tradition with Christian concepts of justice and mercy. The systematic organization of criminal procedures and penalties provided clear guidance for judges while ensuring that punishment would be proportionate to the offense. The influence of Christian thought was evident in the emphasis on rehabilitation and the protection of the innocent. The administrative law provisions of the code reflected the emperor's commitment to efficient government and the protection of citizens' rights. The systematic organization of administrative procedures provided clear guidance for government officials while creating mechanisms for citizens to challenge arbitrary government action. The principles of administrative law preserved in the code would influence the development of government systems throughout Europe. The constitutional law provisions of the code reflected the emperor's understanding of the relationship between imperial authority and legal principle. The systematic treatment of imperial powers and limitations provided a theoretical framework for understanding the nature of governmental authority. The influence of these provisions would be felt in the development of constitutional thought throughout the medieval period. The preservation and transmission of the Justinian Code required the development of new educational institutions and scholarly traditions. Law schools were established throughout the empire to train lawyers in the new system, while copying workshops were organized to produce the manuscripts needed for legal practice. The systematic approach to legal education and scholarship that emerged from these institutions would influence intellectual development for centuries. The economic impact of legal reform was substantial and lasting. The clarity and predictability of the new legal system facilitated commercial development by reducing transaction costs and increasing confidence in contractual relationships. The systematic protection of property rights encouraged investment and economic growth, while the efficient administration of justice reduced the costs of legal disputes. The social impact of the legal reforms was equally significant. The systematic protection of citizens' rights provided security for individuals and families, while the clear organization of legal procedures made justice more accessible to ordinary people. The influence of Christian thought in the legal system promoted social values that emphasized human dignity and the protection of the weak. The political impact of the legal reforms reinforced the emperor's authority while creating institutional frameworks that would outlast his reign. The systematic organization of imperial powers provided theoretical justification for imperial authority while creating legal limitations that would influence the development of governmental institutions. The legal system that emerged from Justinian's reforms would serve as a model for political organization throughout the medieval period. The intellectual impact of the legal reforms was profound and lasting. The systematic approach to legal reasoning that had been developed in the compilation of the Digest influenced the development of scholarly method throughout the medieval period. The principles of logical organization and systematic analysis that had been refined in the legal works would influence the development of philosophy, theology, and other intellectual disciplines. The cultural impact of the legal reforms extended throughout the Christian world. The systematic preservation of Roman legal tradition provided European civilization with a common heritage that would influence cultural development for centuries. The values and principles embedded in the legal system would shape social and political thought throughout the medieval period and beyond. The legacy of Justinian's legal revolution continues to influence legal systems throughout the world. The principles of systematic legal organization, logical reasoning, and comprehensive coverage that were developed in the 6th century remain fundamental to modern legal practice. The civil law systems that predominate in Europe and other parts of the world are direct descendants of the legal system that Tribonian and his colleagues created in the archives of the imperial palace. The emperor who had reunited the Mediterranean under Roman rule had also created the legal foundations that would support European civilization for more than a millennium. The peasant boy from Illyria had become a lawgiver whose works would outlast the empire itself, creating a legacy in legal principle that would influence human society long after the physical monuments of his reign had crumbled. The legal revolution that began in the quiet chambers of the imperial palace would prove to be one of the most lasting achievements of the age of Justinian. The golden age of Justinian's reign, marked by military triumphs, architectural marvels, and legal achievements, was about to face its greatest test. In the year 541, as the emperor celebrated the apparent success of his grand vision for imperial restoration, a shadow was creeping across the Mediterranean world that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his empire. The plague that arrived in Constantinople that year would prove more devastating than any barbarian invasion, more destructive than any military defeat, and more lasting in its consequences than any political crisis the empire had yet faced. The disease that would become known as the Plague of Justinian had originated in the remote highlands of Central Africa, where it had existed for centuries in wild animal populations without affecting human communities. The expansion of trade networks that had accompanied the empire's military and economic recovery inadvertently created pathways for the disease to spread beyond its original boundaries. Merchant ships carrying grain from Egypt, the lifeline that fed Constantinople's massive population, unknowingly transported infected rats and fleas that would unleash devastation across the civilized world. The first reports of the plague came from the port city of Pelusium in Egypt, where merchant vessels from the south had begun arriving with cargoes that included more than grain and precious goods. The disease spread with terrifying speed along the established trade routes, following the same pathways that had carried the wealth of the empire to Constantinople. Within months, the plague had reached the great ports of the eastern Mediterranean, and by the summer of 541, it had arrived in the imperial capital itself. The initial symptoms of the plague were deceptively mild, resembling common fevers that afflicted urban populations regularly. Victims experienced headaches, chills, and general malaise that seemed no more threatening than seasonal ailments. But within days, the disease revealed its true nature as painful swellings appeared in the lymph nodes of the neck, armpits, and groin. These buboes, as they came to be known, grew rapidly and caused excruciating pain before bursting open in bloody, infected wounds that marked the approaching end. The progression of the disease was swift and merciless. Most victims died within a week of the first symptoms, though some succumbed within days. The mortality rate was staggering. Contemporary accounts suggest that up to half of those infected died, though the actual percentage may have been even higher. The disease showed no respect for social status, age, or previous health, striking down senators and slaves, children and adults, the wealthy and the poor with equal ferocity. The emperor himself was not immune to the plague's ravages. In the early months of 542, Justinian fell ill with symptoms that his physicians recognized as the dreaded disease. For weeks, the fate of the empire hung in the balance as the emperor lay fevered and delirious in the imperial palace. The court held its breath as rumors spread through the capital that the emperor was dying, that the plague had claimed the architect of the empire's restoration just as his greatest achievements were reaching fruition. The emperor's illness during the plague crisis revealed both the personal courage that had carried him through previous challenges and the profound dependence of the imperial system on his personal leadership. Theodora, herself at constant risk of infection, maintained the imperial administration while her husband fought for his life. The empress's management of the crisis demonstrated the partnership that had made their reign so successful, as she coordinated relief efforts, maintained government functions, and preserved political stability during the empire's darkest hour. Justinian's recovery from the plague was viewed by contemporaries as nothing short of miraculous. The emperor who had defied death would later claim that divine providence had preserved him to complete his appointed tasks. But the disease had left its mark on both his physical health and his psychological state. The man who emerged from his sickbed was changed, more cautious, more concerned with spiritual matters, and more aware of the fragility of human achievement in the face of forces beyond mortal control. The demographic impact of the plague on the empire was catastrophic. Constantinople, which had been home to perhaps 500,000 people at the height of Justinian's reign, saw its population reduced by an estimated 40% within 2 years. The great cities of the empire, Alexandria, Antioch, Rome, Carthage, all suffered similar devastation. The countryside, though less densely populated, was not spared, as the disease spread along rural trade routes and devastated agricultural communities throughout the empire. The economic consequences of this demographic catastrophe were immediate and severe. The tax base that had supported Justinian's ambitious military and construction programs was suddenly decimated. Agricultural production declined dramatically as rural communities lost substantial portions of their workforce. Urban crafts and commercial activities were disrupted as skilled workers died and trade networks collapsed. The wealth that had made possible the empire's golden age evaporated as communities struggled simply to survive. The military implications of the plague were equally devastating. The professional armies that had reconquered the Mediterranean were decimated by disease, with entire units becoming incapable of effective service. The recruitment of new soldiers became increasingly difficult as the population base from which they could be drawn had been severely reduced. The empire's ability to defend its expanded territories was compromised just as external threats were beginning to intensify. The plague's impact on the church and religious life was profound and complex. Many Christians interpreted the catastrophe as divine punishment for the empire's sins, leading to increased religious fervor and demands for spiritual reform. Monasteries and convents experienced both devastation and growth as some communities were destroyed by the disease, while others attracted new members seeking spiritual consolation. The emperor's own relationship with religious questions deepened as he struggled to understand how such devastation could afflict a Christian empire. The administrative challenges created by the plague required innovative responses that